If Phase 2 fails, political expediency demands a scapegoat. There'll be no explanation and no apology if Phase 2 happens to fail. Harsher measures will be promulgated, surely directed, against the nation's workers.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
That was AFL-CIO President George Meany, and this is COPE Report for January 1972. This month on Side 1, a behind-the-scenes look at Nixon administration efforts to make labor the scapegoat for its failures. Background material especially for trade union officials.
There is little doubt in my mind that much of the news media was taken in by a deliberate White House attempt to contrive a false image about what happened at the AFL-CIO convention. Contrast the news stories written by reporters who were present at the convention.
To find out what happened and how the news media distorted President Nixon's visit to the convention, COPE Report talked with Albert J. Zack, the AFL-CIO's Director of Public Relations.
Within an hour after the president spoke to the convention, 2 White House publicity men were on the telephone to the wire services and the television networks. They wanted to make sure Mr. Meany was cast as a villain and President Nixon as the courageous hero who took on a hostile audience. Of course, that wasn't true, but White House suggestions carry a lot of weight, especially with broadcasters who have to get their license renewed periodically by the federal government.
On Side 2 of this cassette, President Meany answers point by point the White House charges of discourtesy, but the White House pressure was insistent.
Some reporters who covered the convention and who wrote unbiased stories told me their editors had received White House calls urging that the so-called abuse theme be played and replayed. With few exceptions, these reporters were startled by reports of maltreatment of the president. For example, the reporters who were in the convention hall know that the only time the president was jeered was by a far-left group outside the hotel. That group spent most of its time jeering the AFL-CIO.
The White House went a step further and brought out its big gun, John Connally, to denounce Meany.
The Los Angeles Times reported that not long after Mr. Nixon finished his speech, a White House hatchet man, Chuck Colson, a close confidant of the president, called Connally and urged him to hold a press conference. They agreed on a time for November 22nd and called the networks to make sure they'd be there for live coverage. During that press conference, Connally said that in his humble opinion, President Meany was boorish and arrogant. That's hogwash. John Connally has no humble opinions.
The White House did everything it could to give the impression President Nixon was insulted while keeping him above the battle.
Sure, the gimmick was for the president to cancel his plans to stay in Florida over the weekend, and instead to fly back to Washington right after his speech. The official explanation was that he wanted to attend a performance by a Cambodian dance group. Hardly anyone accepted this rationale and played up the theme that the president was upset. At the same time, his spokesman could insist that he wasn't. It was just a piece of theatrics.
How could the public be deceived by the White House propaganda?
First of all, what the public saw on television were edited tapes. For example, one network made it appear that President Meany reconvened the convention while the president was still milling around shaking hands. What was cut out was the 2 minutes of film showing Mr. Nixon leaving. While Mr. Nixon was shaking hands, another network showed film of Mr. Meany talking with a man they identified as one of his aides. The audience got the impression that Meany told the delegates the next thing he'll be doing is kissing babies. The facts are these. The man talking with Meany was not an aide, but rather Hugh Scanlon, a fraternal delegate from England. It was Scanlon, not Meany, who made the remark about kissing babies. And what he said was a wry, not unusual comment about the ways of a politician, shaking hands, kissing babies, and the like. It was a private conversation, and the audience in the hall never heard it. Another network reporter said that the reason listeners couldn't hear jeering by delegates was the position of the microphones. Well, I don't know how you can position microphones to pick up something that wasn't there. All in all, it was a sorry day for that part of the news media that let the White House deceive it.
Is there anything we can do to correct these inaccuracies?
Your answer lies with the truth, and that's what we're going to do. Trade unionists should write the editors of their local papers if they haven't already done so, and answer the White House charges. We'd be happy to supply anyone with an unedited tape recording of President Nixon's visit. It is the best evidence that the delegates were not discourteous to the president. The AFL-CIO has also prepared a pamphlet containing news stories by reporters who attended the convention. It sets the record straight. As President Meany said at the opening of this show, organized labor will not permit this administration to make it the scapegoat for its failures, and we won't let them make us the villain either.
The 92nd Congress is ready to begin its second session. For a report on the first session and a look ahead, Cope Report talked with Andrew J. Biemiller, the AFL-CIO's Director of Legislation.
Our analysis of this Congress is a mixed one indeed. It did some very good things, and it failed to do a lot of other things. There was constant warfare between the administration and the Congress, and that warfare will undoubtedly continue on into the second session. For example, the Congress passed an excellent accelerated public works bill, which the President promptly vetoed. The Congress passed a very fine child development bill, which for the first time would have given working mothers an up-to-date, fine place to leave their children while working. The President vetoed that. On the other hand, after he had vetoed a similar bill a year ago, the President finally did sign a public service jobs bill. That was probably the best bill which passed this Congress from our point of view. What we wanted this Congress to do was to stimulate the economy, to find ways of creating jobs. I think on the whole the Congress did its part, but the President certainly put a damper on everything that was coming along.
Mr. Biemiller also cited the campaign reform bill that is pending final action.
In that campaign reform bill, there are some good things. There is a limitation, for example, placed upon the amount of money that can be spent by any candidate, including the President, on TV and radio. And with the limitation that has been placed in this bill, it will not be possible for a wealthy candidate to outdo one who does not have large resources at his command. We were also successful in warding off the Crane Amendment, which would, for all practical purposes, have stopped a lot of COPE operations. We did succeed in attaching to the bill the Hansen Amendment, which now puts into statutory form the pursuits that we can follow in any political campaign and will make it possible for us to continue the kind of work we have been doing in politics.
Mr. Biemiller, what are the major items that will come up in the second session?
During the second session of the Congress, there are still many pieces of legislation which will be considered. The Senate, for example, will start on the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission bill, a bill which we favor very strongly, which will give to the EEOC the same cease and desist powers in enforcing its decrees that the National Labor Relations Board and the Federal Trade Commission now have. This bill was defeated in the House by a narrow margin of 7 votes, where a weak substitute was adopted. We have high hopes of passing it in the Senate and coming out of conference with a very good bill. Other matters that will get a good deal of attention include the question of strengthening and using some form of federal reinsurance on private pension plans. The administration has a very weak, meaningless bill meaningless at least as far as the rank-and-file membership of the AFL-CIO is concerned, very meaningful for wealthy people to whom they would give additional tax deductions for their private pension plans. We are anticipating action on a health insurance bill. Hearings were conducted on this matter during the first session of the Congress, and the Ways and Means Committee has promised to report a bill. You should keep in touch with your congressmen and senators in favor of H.R. 22 and S3, the Griffiths-Kennedy bill, which is the bill we are supporting in this field. It is the only really sound bill. We anticipate in the House the Rules Committee will be reporting out the minimum wage bill, which bogged down during the closing weeks of the first session. This bill would establish a minimum wage of $2 and extend coverage to a great many additional people. Another matter that will be up in the Senate before long is the welfare reform bill, H.R. 1. This is a bill that would start to make some sense in the messed up welfare situation that now exists in most states by having the federal government in effect take over the welfare program, but it also contains many improvements in the Social Security law, which are badly needed. For example, it would raise the contribution level to $10,200 and in that way raise pensions for the better paid workers automatically. It would increase all pensions by 10%. These are certainly desirable additions to the Social Security system. There is also a move on foot to strengthen the public service jobs bill by adding additional funds and additional jobs. We certainly favor this proposal. On the other hand, we will resist attempts which the administration will make to try to turn the job of covering the whole manpower program's activities by state governments rather than the federal government. We think this would be a weakening of the training programs that are now in existence.
How did the administration's legislative program fare during the first session, Mr. B. Miller?
The administration, of course, did not fare very well with most of its program. Unfortunately, it did succeed in passing a very bad tax bill which turns over a great deal of money to the corporations which should be used for various kinds of public works projects and other public investments in schools and the like that are badly needed. The administration did pass its economic stabilization bill, extending its powers for another year to go ahead with the pay board and the price board and the other schemes that it is using to try to stabilize the economy. We were successful, however, in adding to that bill a proposal that makes it mandatory to pay wages that were held up during the price freeze of August 15th until November 15th. The administration's proposals on revenue sharing went down the drain. There is a proposal that has been introduced by Congressman Mills and many others for aid to the cities, which will probably have our support during the forthcoming session.
Mr. B. Miller, what will be labor's job in 1972?
Now, labor's job in 72 is the job it has always been. Reward your friends and punish your enemies. We will be issuing a roll call on the first session early in January 1972, and at the conclusion of the second session, another roll call on it. Read it, follow it, and take proper action in the election in 72.
In his keynote address to the AFL-CIO convention, President Meany made this observation.
So we're really at a historic moment in the life of this nation. Whether for good or evil, only time will tell. This is the first time in the history of America that any president ever set out to control the economic life of the nation in peacetime. Now, it's no disrespect to the president to say that on the basis of his track record, we don't have very much confidence. But it's obvious that if the present program don't work, and there is no sure indication that it will work, the next step would be more stringent and oppressive measures that could destroy our American institutions.
Labor will be blamed if Phase 2 fails.
If Phase 2 fails, political expediency demands a scapegoat. The man in the White House never says it's my fault. No politician ever says it's his fault. It demands a scapegoat, and we have no doubt as to who that scapegoat will be. Just as we had no explanation as to why the Nixon-Burns original economic game plan failed so miserably, there'll be no explanation and no apology if Phase 2 happens to fail. Harsher measures will be promulgated, surely directed against the nation's workers and their unions, and we can expect anti-strike edicts and injunction and all the other harassment that have been the lot of labor in the authoritarian countries in recent history.
What must labor do?
We must therefore stand united as never before. For never before has so much depended upon the strength and unity of the family of labor.
Cope Report continues on side 2 of this cassette with President Meany's rebuttal to White House charges of discourtesy and a report on the 1972 election.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The accusations of discourtesy on the part of the AFL-CIO in connection with President Nixon's visit are absolutely and completely untrue and unfair. I didn't hear any booing. I didn't hear any jeering on the part of the delegates during the president's visit. I've been accused of being discourteous, that I placed the president in the second row. Well, this is the chair where all of our distinguished visitors sit in the brief moment before their introduction. And when you go back over the history, John F. Kennedy sat in that chair. Lyndon Johnson sat in that chair.
When the Union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. For no force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one, but the Union makes us strong.
On November 19, 1971, President Nixon addressed the AFL-CIO convention. After the president spoke, the White House immediately launched a campaign to convince the American people through the news media that the convention had treated the president discourteously. This month on Cope Report, we will examine the accusations and the truth. Three days after the president spoke to the convention, AFL-CIO President George Meany set the record straight.
On the 23rd of September, I invited the President of the United States to address this convention. And this is in accordance with a long-time practice that no matter who the President is, he's the first man we invite to our convention. A few days later, I received a reply from George Shultz, which said that the President would, of course, consider this, look over his schedule, and they would be in touch with us a little later. Well, 7 weeks passed. No word of any kind. No word whether he was coming, no word that he was not coming.
The night before the convention opened, the president finally responded.
At 8:30 in the evening, I was in the coffee shop downstairs, and I got a telephone call from George Shultz, in which he said the president wanted to address our convention at noon on Thursday. It would seem that was a little lack of courtesy there. He could have told us this. We would have been glad to work out something. But just 12 hours before the convention was to convene. So I told him it would be impossible to make that arrangement, that there was a council meeting set for 12 noon, but that I would be delighted to have the president later in the afternoon or any time he wanted on Friday. So the Friday date was set up for 10:30. And immediately on Thursday afternoon and evening, we were visited by a large number of security people whose job it is to protect the person of the president. And they laid out in minute detail the arrangements for Friday morning, right to the minute, schedule as to time and place, told us who could be here, who could be there. And according to that arrangement, we proceeded on Friday morning. It was arranged that I would leave this podium at 22 minutes after 10, meet the escort committee, meet the president, and the president would come up and be here about 28 minutes after 10, and he would address this audience. So with all their requests, insofar as security was concerned, they had complete and absolute cooperation.
Mr. Meany refused only two requests made by the White House.
They did request that I move these 4 tables here right back to this stand in order that they could put in special television cameras. Well, I refused to grant that request. I said that this would upset the arrangements for 80 or 90 delegates. We had television cameras, and I didn't feel that we should change that situation. Then I was asked, would I have the orchestra play ruffles and flourishes as the president marched from the little door over to here. I said, well, we don't have an orchestra. We have what you might call chamber music, and I don't think you can play ruffles and flourishes on a violin. I could be wrong on that, but this is my impression.
There was even a claim by the White House that Mr. Meany refused to introduce the president to the convention.
He came to this platform, and he sat in that chair right there. And I presented him to the audience with the traditional introduction to the president. You don't elaborate when you introduce the president. You merely say, ladies and gentlemen, the president of the United States. Now, he was warmly applauded when he was introduced. He was applauded at least 8 times during his speech. There was some laughter when he said that prices were coming down, and if you didn't believe it, ask your wives, ask the housewives of America. Well, and I'm willing to concede that this laughter was of a type that indicated disagreement with the president, and I think the ladies laughed the loudest. However, we certainly still have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights, and I still think we have a constitutional right to laugh.
After the president spoke, he departed from the schedule laid down in advance by his aides.
At the conclusion of the president's talk, I came to this mic to express my appreciation, and I assumed that when I'd finished doing that, according to the instructions we'd received the night before, that I would then leave here with him and the escort committee, and his people would pick him up and put him in his car and send him on his way. However, when I finished a very short expression of appreciation, I turned my head and he was gone. The escort committee was sitting here and he just went right by them. Before the president finished, just at the time he was leaving, the security people took that rope barrier down. And when the president left here, instead of going to the office, he turned and he went into this rope barrier. White House photographer appeared. There was a fellow carrying a great, big, enormous, glaring light, and the president started to mill around over here. After 2 or 3 minutes of that, the delegates and the guests all started to converge over here, and I took the mic and I said, as I said many times, will the delegates and guests kindly take their seats? Well, that's the subject of another accusation. They said that I tried to continue the business of the convention while the president still had the floor. Well, when he left, I committed the cardinal sin of saying that, well, let's go on with the second act. But that was my reaction.
Mr. Meany then summarized the events of the day.
Insofar as courtesy is concerned, I think that we showed the respect that's due to the President of the United States. We were not discourteous. There was no booing. There was no jeering. As far as his conduct was concerned, he gave us a speech. Oh, he threw away his written text, and that corny act is as old as the Republic. His speech was pure political propaganda, and I have no objection to that because we hear a lot of that, and he certainly should not be barred from making a political speech. However, he did not discuss the one major item upon which we differ with the administration, and that is the validity of our contracts. Oh, he said that he read the terms under which we were going to sit on the pay board, and he said very forcefully, I know what I can do, and that's what I'm going to do, but he didn't tell us. But he did not discuss the issue that certainly is the major, basic issue that is disturbing the trade unions of America. Do we have the right to sign a contract with our employers and see that contract observed, or have we lost that right? I don't think we have, and we're not going to stop fighting for it. I have the impression the president did not come here to make a speech. He came here to contrive a situation under which he could claim that he had been unfairly treated. I recall something that happened in San Jose, California during the 1970 campaign, where he was supposed to be badly abused by some students, and after some investigation, all of the press out there agreed pretty much that the whole incident was very carefully staged.
Mr. Meany told the delegates he was proud of the AFL-CIO and the polite manner in which the president was received.
We respect the office, we respect the man that holds the office, and we're going to continue to do that. However, this doesn't mean that we've got to be subservient to the man who holds the office. This does not mean that our respect for the president and his office calls for us to submit to something that we consider unjust. Otherwise, our pride in America and its institutions would be meaningless. This is still a democracy. This is still not a monarchy. And the respect for the president and the respect for our rights as Americans is part and parcel of the entire American way of life, to which we are committed without reservation. Thank you.
The stakes in the 1972 election will be high. To find out what is at stake, Cope Report talked with Lane Kirkland, the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO.
3 years of the Nixon administration have left the American economy in a shambles. Unemployment, up nearly 100%. Today, more than 5 million workers are without jobs. Prices, up nearly 16% in 3 years, rubbing out the hard-earned wage increases of working people. A freeze that hit hardest at those who have the least, followed by a so-called Phase 2 that locks workers and the poor behind a permanent 8-ball in relation to prices. If he had deliberately searched for ways to injure American workers and their families, President Nixon could have found none more harmful than the policies he and his advisors contrived. In human and economic terms, in terms of the problems and needs of working people, the Nixon administration has been a dismal period of recession and reaction.
Mr. Kirkland, what can union members do?
We've got to register every single union member and every member of his family that we can. We've got to spread the story of the harmful consequences of Nixon's economic policies. We've got to produce a record turnout at the polls. We've got to contribute more to COPE than we ever have before. We've got to do everything possible to help elect a new progressive administration in 1972. And if we're going to do this, we have to support COPE to the hilt.
For a final look at the political scene, COPE Report called its Texas correspondent.
Folks, I want to bring up a sort of embarrassing subject. Dick Nixon. I wouldn't think of mentioning it, except that down here in Texas, my cousin Claude has come down with a severe case of what's been diagnosed as Nixonitis. It ain't like the measles and the mumps now. It's more sort of an emotional disorder, what the psychiatrists call a trauma. We knowed Claude had it when he got dizzy spells and broke out in a cold sweat every time he heard the word Dick Nixon. The reason I'm warning you against it is it's incapacitating. Causes you to sit around with negative feelings about politics instead of positive feelings and getting out and doing something about it. When Cousin Claude come down with his case of Nixonitis, we had to put him to bed. Since I'm the one that cared for him, I figure I ought to pass on what I did for him to you. Now, first of all, I talked positive to Cousin Claude. Tried to get his mind off his trauma. I said, Cousin Claude, don't take Dick Nixon too seriously. He makes mistakes. Cousin Claude just groaned and said, far as I'm concerned, Dick Nixon's just one big mistake from beginning to end. I says, now, Cousin Claude, wait a minute. He says, no, sir. Dick Nixon and his crowd will lie on credit when they can tell the truth for cash. I said, now, Claudie, take it easy. Dick don't mean to be untruthful. He just can't help it. Claude said, well, he don't have to tell such whoppers, saying unemployment ain't but 6% in this country. I know better than that. I ain't had no work for 8 months, and I call that 100% unemployment. I said, but Claude, Dick's trying. Look at his new freeze. He says, that freeze wasn't nothing new to me. Me and my neighbors have been out in the cold ever since Dick Nixon and his boys took over. I said, yes, but Dick says he set up a price wage control board to protect you and your family from inflation. Ain't that sweet? Claudia said, yes, it sure are sweet after he let inflation rise 16% and smothers us all. Then he protects us by stacking them control boards with his own sort, making sure the working folks and consumers keep getting the short end of the stick. But folks, you know, I seen that Claudia was beginning to think positive on it. The color come back to his cheeks, and I said, well, Claudia, you must be feeling better. Claudia says, I am. I just now remembered. This here's 1972, election year. And I'm declaring open season on Dick and his bunch. Just can't wait till election day. Get down to them polls, take my ballot, and start thinning out the Dick Nixons in this country.
This has been COPE Report for January 1972. Next month, more up-to-the-minute information and commentary on the elections of 1972.
Solidarity